Alpesh Patel is here from Brythinium Partners, and we'll get to that, Alpesh, but good morning. And,
good morning.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Starting with Sarko, the International Herald Tribune saying that he could become the first one-termer since Valéry Giscard d'Estaing lost to François Mitterrand in 1981.
The problem he faces at the moment, beyond all the obvious ones about the macroeconomy, is the problem of incumbency. Monsieur Hollande can promise just about anything. In particular, he can promise the magical fantasy of growth. He can say, I will deliver you growth, and that means that when I also increase taxes on the rich, who are also only 1% of the French population, so we're not too bothered about them voting in huge numbers, you will not have austerity measures. Sarkozy cannot promise growth, because if he could, he would already have done it, and lacks the credibility to promise this fantasy of growth. That's the problem of incumbency, and that's why he will almost certainly lose.
But independent economists, all economists of course are independent, but independent economists suggest that growth forecasts have actually been downgraded pretty sharply for France. So irrespective of what is promised by the politicians, you know, nobody buys it, do they?
Oh, the economists don't buy it, but there aren't enough economists voting in the French election. The public will be more than happy to buy it, because if I promise them that, oh, don't worry, the austerity measures aren't coming with me, but they will with the other guy, who are you going to vote for? You're going to take your chances with the person who's making the promise.
Well, Sarko's not that austere either, is he?
He's got no choice but to be austere. He's certainly got to give that signal, because he's trapped by having been in the Élysée Palace under circumstances where he had to be austere. He can't suddenly say, you know what, the policies that was implemented by the government are no longer going to be implemented going forward. He's been austere up till now, and his forward-looking plans have to be an extension of that. They can't simply flip and change, whereas Monsieur Hollande starts with a blank sheet of paper. As I say, that's the problem of incumbency.
What really strikes me about this is that there's a great deal of personal dislike for the man, and you get the distinct impression, don't you, that he's being seen as a bit of an upstart, most definitely an outsider, not part of the patrician establishment of French politics.
And it's part of the problem with French politics that the president has always been the embodiment of the nation of France. And at the moment, when France is, its pride is being hurt by the fact that it may need to look at bailouts, it's suffering from, as are so many countries in Europe, with unemployment and so on, and you're feeling these austere times, then the individual that you see as the personification of your nation also very easily gets portrayed as the person who is the cause of your ills. And to some extent, he's been outmaneuvered. He hasn't seen this coming. It has been a case of, and I don't think his wife's been in the newspapers too much for one reason or in particular, which is it's been perceived as this is somebody who's living it up at times, and it is a palace that they live in, living it up at times when the rest of the French nation is not able to. And that is at least one step they've taken, which is you will not see images of Mrs. Sarkozy in the newspapers if the president can help it.
She's probably in the West Wing strumming a guitar instead. Spain and Italy, the consensus appears to be that they won't need bailouts. Would you agree with that?
Well, in a way, that's not the relevant issue. What's relevant here is one of credibility. Do we believe that, do we believe that the ECB will either bail out with the help of the IMF, which essentially means the Germans to a large extent, or do we believe that their austerity measures means that they won't need bailing out? Let's put some context onto the Spanish debt problem. Actually, Spanish debt to their overall GDP is less than that of America. They're in a better debt to GDP situation than the Americans are, than the Germans are. Their annual deficit, their budget deficit, is not as bad as the United Kingdom's. Their annual deficit is less than 10%. Their problem is one of unemployment, because their wages haven't decreased over the last 7 years, unlike in Germany, which has meant that the Germans have remained competitive. The Spanish, with wages remaining the same, have not remained competitive. Instead, what's happened is people have been made redundant to save wage costs, as opposed to saying we'll just reduce salaries and keeping more people in employment.
And the critical thing seems to be striking the balance, getting the right balance, as the IMF was saying a bit earlier this week. Cut off growth by imposing too much austerity. Are they getting the balance right in order to...
They're not. The major problem is the public sector, which is a huge employer in Western Europe in particular, if the public sector, instead of freezing salaries, had said, look, we're not going to be freezing salaries, we're actually going to be cutting them by 5%, find that 5% elsewhere from your cuts in your own personal budgets, they would make a significant dent into their budget deficit. But they're merely freezing salaries. Most people will tell you that they would be more than happy to take a small salary cut and have greater security in their jobs than have salaries frozen and not know whether they're going to be in a job, and thereby the knock-on effect being that they reduce spending and so on. You'd far rather have certainty of knowing your job's secure for another 24 months, but only if you take a mere 5% cut. And that's what the public sector is not doing. If the Spanish did that, it would also make them more competitive. It would cut back on their budget deficit. It would mean that tax revenues are maintained because you've got less people in unemployment.
You make the interesting point, of course, that, and the valid point, that it's not really the size of your debt, it's your ability to service it, which is the point. Let's move on to missiles, shall we?
Yes, absolutely.
Again, size matters.
Well, the Indians would say, in actual fact, this isn't a race, a nuclear proliferation race, where size does matter. What they would say is they've got the minimum deterrent. What's interesting here is it was the South China Morning Post which said that China is unfazed, which you would expect their major newspaper to say. More interestingly, the newspaper of the ruling Communist Party has said, has not been so unfazed. They've made it clear that India should not try to contain China, neither should the West. They see this as just an extension of the West. What's also important to note, and again putting this into context, NATO and Russia certainly don't see India as a threat. And unlike China, India's political ambitions tend not to go outside its borders. For whatever reason, Indian politicians don't seem to be that concerned with projecting force around the world. Unlike the Chinese, not saying that the Chinese are wrong to project force around the world. After all, they would argue the Americans certainly do so. Why should there not be a counterbalance? But India also is not seen, certainly by the West, as a proliferator, unlike the Chinese, who are accused of passing nuclear technology to Pakistan, who in turn have passed it on to Iran. So basically the bottom line is the Indians are going to get away with this without sanctions, without much of a hoo-ha from the West, that's for sure.
The time is really running against us, so if we can quickly trot through the FT, a picture of Bob Diamond, head of Barclays, of course. Is it shareholders fight back?
Yes, thank God the capitalists are getting some money at last, and the workers who are getting away with murder. Not least because as a poor capitalist, my value in Barclays shares has dropped 50% since 1999. I'm not getting dividends, I'm not getting a capital return, but the workers are getting overpaid. So Karl Marx, to some extent, was right that the workers in the end will win, and they have been, certainly in the banks, and us poor capitalists are getting absolutely no return, and we're feeling very poor.
Briefly, I don't know if you have any children, but do they stand up when you walk in? When I stand up, people don't still realise that I'm standing up. But
we used to at my school as a mark of respect to the teachers, but I really don't think the Prime Minister should be getting bogged down in the minutiae. It may be a good idea, it may not, but this is just fodder for the newspapers to make a laughing stock out of a political party.
Alpesh Patel, thank you very much indeed. Alpesh Patel joining us for the newspapers this morning. Thanks for being with us.